Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett from the International Yeats Society, and I'm here at State University of New York at Geneseo, and we're talking about a poem called Meru, and I'm with Matthew Campbell. Hi, Matt. How you doing?
Hi, Rob. How are you?
It's great to see you.
Good.
Uh,
Same to you. Yep.
so Matt's a professor of modern lit at University of York. Your first book, Rhythm and Will in Victorian Poetry. Your second is that I know and love, Irish Poetry Under the Union. You're also editor of Irish Literature and Translation. And I know you mainly as the director of the Yeats International Summer School, which you did for, I think, 5 or 6 years, it seems like. And I know you're working on the Oxford Handbook of Yeats coming up. Is that the main focus of your?
That's right, Rob. Yeah, with Lauren Arrington, and Lauren and I were co-directors of the Yeats Summer School for a couple of years. Lauren and I have edited the Oxford Handbook of Yeats, which is a massive book, which is 42 chapters and over 300,000 words, which will all be available online and published next year. So it's in with the press. Everything's underway. So it's anyway, it's been a lot of work. We're really proud of it.
I know a lot of people contributing to that. It sounds like it is going to be absolutely fantastic, and I know everybody's looking forward to that coming out. So that's going to be great. Now so you chose this. You could have chosen any poem. You chose this strange little poem at the end of Supernatural Songs. Why did you pick this one?
Well, it's quite nice to have a chat about a short poem, particularly something like this, so that if anybody's listening in, they can have a look at the poem and they can see what's happening to it. I think another reason I chose it is it's quite an unusual thing for Yeats. It's a sonnet, and I think for a poet who's known for his forms, the ottava rima, the ballad form, all of the various ways in which Yeats wrote, he's not really known for his sonnets. Of course, Leda and the Swan is one of his best known poems, and it is sonnet. But it's quite unusual that lots of poems kind of start off looking like something, then they turn into something else in Yeats. So it's quite nice to think about a sonnet, and in particular this particular sonnet, because it's a sonnet which really is a game of two halves, as they say in soccer. Even though the two halves of a sonnet, of course, are disequilibrium between the 8 and 6. So it's quite good about thinking about two things that are going on in the poem, as well as the one thing that's going on, which is the sonnet form.
Well, and unusual too, with a lot of his sonnets are truncated. I mean, we often get these 12-line poems, and this is unusual with the concluding couplet. And I think that couplet is really important for thinking about the whole poem and the way it's reflecting on supernatural songs. And it has, I think, Yeats's whole overall career in some ways. So how about you, if you don't mind, if you want to share your screen and show us?
Okay, I will do. And I just for anybody who's listening in now, I'm going to share the screen and I'm going to read the poem twice.
Okay.
And maybe Rob and I might get on to think about why you would need to read it twice, because there are two different versions of this poem. But there is what looks initially like a tiny difference, but it's something which I kind of think it might be good and a bit of fun if is the American word nerdy, a little bit nerdy about thinking about why it is that there is what the difference is and why it might be important. Yeah,
Okay.
that'd be okay. Yeah,
that sounds great.
I apologize if the second time I read it, if I ham it up to point to the difference, I apologize for that as well too.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so here we go. The poem was first published in. Excuse me. Here we go. The poem was first published in Poetry magazine, a magazine which Yeats was associated for a long time, and in 1934. And when it appeared in Poetry magazine, it looked like this, and it really does look like a sonnet because there are 8 lines and 6 lines. So just on the page, it looks like a sonnet. And if you came upon it back in 1934, you would have read this, Meru, or indeed maybe Meru. Anyway, Meru. Civilization is hooped together, brought under a rule, under the semblance of peace, by manifold illusion. But man's life is thought. And he, despite his terror, cannot cease, ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting, that he may come into the desolation of reality. Egypt and Greece goodbye, and goodbye Rome. hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest, caverned in night under the drifted snow, or where that snow and winter's dreadful blast beat down upon their naked bodies, know that day brings round the night, that before dawn his glory and his monuments are gone. And in 1935, when it was published in Afu March in the little section known as Parnell's Funeral,
Mm-hmm.
it looked like this.
Oh, and I see the change. Okay, go ahead.
Meru, civilization is hooped together, brought under a rule, under the semblance of peace, by manifold illusion. But man's life is thought, and he, despite his terror, cannot cease, ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting, that he may come into the desolation of reality. Egypt and Greece, goodbye, and goodbye, Rome! Hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest, caverned in night under the drifted snow, or where that snow and winter's dreadful blast beat down upon their naked bodies, know that day brings round the night, that before dawn his glory and his monuments are gone.
Nice. An exclamation point.
An exclamation on the eighth line. So the octave and the sestet have been squashed together with no gap between them, but the exclamation mark is pointing to something quite significant, which Yeats is trying to point us in the direction of. And I'm sorry, I rather hammed up and ruined it by exclamating. But sometimes I think about that. Egypt and Greece, goodbye, Rome is a bit like crazy, like they're coming to take us away. Ha ha, they're coming to take me away. It's a kind of an element, a kind of a what's the word? A kind of hysterical element, which is introduced into it at that point.
It's so interesting because whenever I read this poem, I took a class years ago with Helen Vendler, and I hear Helen Vendler reading it, and the version we read had the exclamation point, and she loved that line, and she kind of reveled in that exclamation. So not quite as far as you went, but I hear that kind of that sort of that kind of delight in the whole thing, and you're right, that sort of element of the hysterical going on. That's different in the first versions.
Yeah, indeed, and I mean there are other ways in which I mean I know we kind of picked the poem itself out of the collected poems, and if one were to read it in and I've got Daniel Albright's invaluable edition here, a slightly wacky edition. For any students who are reading Daniel Albright, some of the notes are amazing. Some of the notes are like, wacky, if that's a word that I can use, the wacky races. But when you come upon Meru in Albright, you see that it is number 12 of a sequence, rather than a sonnet sitting on its own. So, and that, as you said, Rob, is the supernatural songs. And there's something to do with the tone of the supernatural songs themselves in Parnell's Funeral, which they do transgress, and that's, I use the word advisedly, transgress on lots of weird stuff, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the tone of all of the supernatural songs, to use your word, has a bit of wackiness going on, and a transgression of sort of religious doctrine, and deliberately making a mockery of the certainties of religious doctrine, and saying things that are in those supernatural songs that are pretty shocking, especially about sexuality.
Yes. If I can read what Albright has to say about the sequence, he talks about them being about violence, and he talks about the types of violence that are in the sequence as well too. And that those types of violence are to do with sexual violence, as well as other kinds of violence, flagellation, autoeroticism, fellatio. Now, I'm not saying that all these things are necessarily violent, but there's something going on about what is being described in it, which is basically the gods making love, isn't that it? And what happens when the gods make love? Yes, and how it is that they. Sorry, these things, it's an unfortunate metaphor, but how it is that they force themselves upon human history in ways which many people find very, very difficult when they think about Yeats.
Mhm, mhm.
Leda and the Swan, for instance, is an immensely a great poem, but an immensely difficult poem. And I think that both for you, I don't know what you think about this, Rob, but for me, I find it incredibly difficult to teach that poem
Es-
because of the implications of
Especially over the
sexual
last
violence.
couple of years with Me Too in the U.S., it's a such a different context for thinking about that poem, and I do struggle teaching it now.
Yeah. Yes, I know it's very difficult. I think both of us heard Elizabeth Butler Cullingford
Yeah.
give an amazing talk about a
Yes.
year or so ago about why she wants to teach it, but why she knows that it's so difficult to teach it.
Hmm, hmm.
And I know that in our Oxford Handbook, Rona Gork has a powerful account of what that means for the contemporary woman poet as well.
Hmm, hmm.
Yeah. But Meru comes at the end of that sequence, and somehow these matters seem to have gone, or have they gone? Again, I think I rather advisedly used a sexist term, hysterical,
Hmm.
um, a while ago, and that is again a very, very difficult term which we've got to watch ourselves whenever we use it. But there's something which is going on here where the tone of the poems has been heightened to such an extent,
Hmm.
and then for the sequence to be left with this thing again is very, very odd. Now that thing just may have been dragged out of maybe I don't know whether he intended to publish it in part of a sequence or thought it might be a good place to end the sequence. And you could think that the last 6 lines, the sestet, might be a good way to calm everything down into a kind of a passive mysticism.
Hmm.
But to get there, there's something else that's kind of difficult and violent, which is going on before you get there.
Hmm, hmm. So, do you want to take us through
Yeah.
three of them?
Well, I mean, we might get to the exclamation mark in a minute. But the complicated thing is to do with that there is a description here of a social order which is pulling itself apart. And for Yeats, of course, well, we know this from the Second Coming. We know this through any number of apocalyptic poems through the 1920s and the 1930s. And then into the 1930s, when it looked as if certainly the inverted commas Western world
Hmm.
um, looked as if it was pulling itself apart as it moved to a version of populist politics that, for want of a better word, we call fascist.
Hmm, hmm.
And that fascism based in ideas of Greece and Rome,
Hmm,
um, in the Italian version of it,
hmm.
that in an aesthetic based in Greco-Roman architecture, that's something to do with ideas of proportion and order, but that politics was not dealing with proportion and order in the classical European sense. It was dealing with something else. It was dealing with ravening, raging, and uprooting, and that something was happening to Western culture, which Yeats would have thought that he kind of prophesied, or rather, those who spoke to him through his wife George when he was going through all of the automatic writing and the kind of the mystical, the seance and the mediumistic experiences, which led to his version of world history in a vision. In that there was in Marxist terms, a dialectic happening, the
Hmm.
point at which the settled, the ordered, the liberal order of Western Europe was about to give way to something else, famously the rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem.
Hmm.
So I think that the octave deals with that question of a civilization which is about to pull itself apart in the same way that the Greeks pulled themselves apart.
Hmm.
Now, what it does, though, of course, when it goes back to Egypt and Greece and Rome, it in that one line with the exclamation mark at the end, in that one line at the end, how many thousands of years are contained in that line?
Hmm.
From the loss of the Egyptian Empire to the destruction of the Greek civilization to the destruction of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
All of these points, which on the great wheel of world history are thousands of years, and all of these are telescoped into the middle of the 1930s.
Mm. And the way that Gates in this poem deals with that kind of immensity of this entire history, the whole thing, and the lovely word hooped together with
Yeah,
connects nicely with the representations of Meru,
yeah,
um, as this the mountain that's the imagined mountain
Yeah,
that has all these circular that's has all these circles around it. I think
yeah,
is really nice.
yeah. The hooping, I love that word too. I love that word too, and it's a kind of a weird word because it's. I mean, people know the word appears elsewhere in the supernatural songs in the little 4-line poem called "There,"
Hmm.
which goes, "There all the barrel hoops are knit, there all the serpent tails are hit, there all the gyres converge in one, there all the planets drop in the sun." And it goes all the way to the kind of the great entropic end of end of life as everybody's sucked into the sun at the end of it. But the
Hmm.
barrel hoops are knit, and so he's got these ideas of interconnection. The word gyre is in that word there, but it's not in this word here. So the hoop is going like that. You know, of course, the gyre is. Sorry, it's impossible. It's like a spiral staircase. It's impossible to describe these things without using your hands. But of course, the gyre is going either out like that or in like that. But the hoop is just hooped around the barrel. That's what the art of the cooper is, to hoop everything together. And he says in there, he says even worse than that. He says barrel hoops are knit. I don't know how you would knit a barrel hoop. Maybe that is a technical term from the cooper, if there were coopers anymore. I suppose there are in Kentucky or wherever they, wherever they put the whiskey or the wine, or in Burgundy where they put but the knitting. Sorry, it's impossible to do these things without using your fingers. The knitting and the hooping is also important here. And you could see what he's doing here. Civilization is hooped together.
Mm. Mm.
It's uh, so
And
wonderful. It's not really a gyre, it's not really knitting, but there's something about an order, a control, which is in and is contained within that barrel, but it's about to burst.
I was thinking about what you're saying about the 30s brought under rule and
Yeah.
this sort of authoritarianism, and then the line under the semblance of peace, as if there's a kind of order that is superficial, or sort of day-to-day lives that we imagine civilization as having this kind of order and stability, and maybe that's we imagine that because we're caught by what he says here is a manifold illusion by man's so this idea of like what is the manifold illusion then? Is it our what do you think of that?
I I think this is an illusion. An allusion. I think that he's borrowing from the ideas of Edmund Burke,
Mm,
who's the classic liberal conservative philosopher and a great example for Yeats, because Burke, even though Burke is often thought of as being, say, an apologist for primogeniture, for instance, like the divine right of kings, or the fact that the son of the king will go on to be the next king, or the son of the queen, or whatever it is, will go on to be the next king. Even though Burke is thought as being somebody who argues for that, he doesn't. He say that these are the illusions by which we must live our lives. And Burke knew that even property itself, and that is not a hard and fast law, that property itself is something which we must contend, that the law itself is an illusion which enables order in a society, that these are fictions of society which are the reasons why society holds itself together. So what happens when you challenge those fictions by which you hold it together?
mm,
And for me, reading this poem recently, I could see that it begins to bring up the challenges to the socially liberal, responsible, respectful order by which we have lived our lives in the 21st century as much as in the 1930s. And what it says to me is that you get strong populist figures, and they can come and they can challenge the illusion.
mm,
Now, they either replace, and what they do is that they replace it with a stronger illusion of order.
mm, mm,
In the United States, I think it's the populism associated with Donald Trump.
mm,
In the UK, where I'm living, It's the populism associated with the Brexit movement, which has led to a certain kind of populist conservatism, which is now also kind of slightly mimicking the populist republicanism in the Republicans in the States, and all of these movements are going all across Europe. If France, there may very well be a populist president next in France. These movements were very, very strong in Italy as well. In Greece, indeed, at the time of the economic crash, it was a left-wing populist movement. And that populist movement is strong in Spain as well, too, on the left. So there's something going on with these movements which are attempting to uproot or destabilize the liberal order, because the liberal order keeps itself going by manifold illusion.
It's one of the really common statements you'd see in the press throughout Trump's presidency is people realizing the degree to which the structure of the US government is held together by a lot of these kind of forms, that they're not written down, they're sort of agreements, they're ways of behaving, that then Trump disrupted. And I think I taught Burke last year, and that was one of the things we discussed, and my students are, sort of recoil a bit often against some elements of Burkean conservatism, especially as you're talking about private property. But I was talking to them about how the importance of performance, that we follow rituals, we follow ceremonies, and they give a kind of structure and meaning and sense of stability. But they depend upon, as Yeats says here, this manifold illusion. We have to believe in them in order to make them real. We enact their reality over and over again. And if a person does not do that, those forms then start to disintegrate. Yes. And what's left after that can be there's a kind of energy and there's a kind of excitement that might come with that disruption. But there's also something that can be terrifying, as you're saying, the replacement of one illusion with another one. Yeah. And certainly in the 30s, that we see that going on.
Yes, well, I mean, again, to go back to the Burke and to do with that question of that illusion is that Yeats is drawn to a figure. No, I'm not saying that Burke apologizes for, but for instance, the aristocracy in Britain or in Ireland, the aristocracy went in and they took the land. The Normans arrived in and they stole the land, right? So there were acts of of blatant theft, yeah. And the order of property is based on an original act of theft. Mm-hmm. Now, that's even assuming that anybody owned the land in the first place. I mean, even in Britain now where I live, there's still common land. It still does exist in small parts in Britain. There are still places, in other words, places that fields, parks that nobody owns, right? So that what was left behind of the previous civilization has then been taken over by the other civilization. And then also, I'm living in Britain, I live in Yorkshire, and I'm surrounded by stately homes, many of which are still owned and occupied by the aristocracy, who were gifted them in the 17th century, or depending on whose side they backed in whatever British Civil War. And the same thing goes for Ireland. And Yeats knows that was the case in Ireland. Now, in the 1930s, of course, in a new state, in which the aristocracy had been I was going to say disinherited, but certainly the land was taken off, a large number of them, and their houses were burnt down. Anybody who reads Elizabeth Bowen's Last September, there's a great book about the burning down. It's a great house. And of course, Coole Park, Yeats's or Lady Gregory's house, that also was burnt down as well too. There was only an empty square in the middle of Coole Park where Lady Gregory's house used to be. So he knew that something was happening with the old civilization, because people knew that the new ideas, the new thinking, man's life, its thought, that the new thinking was going to replace the other one. So what looks as if it is a natural order, this is the great question about Edmund Burke's politics. It looks as if there's a natural order. There's a hierarchy. There's a king. There are nobles. There's a bourgeoisie. There's a working class. That this kind of hierarchical natural order is not the case. That man's thinking, and that might be like the 18th century, the Enlightenment, whatever it is, whether that's a goody or a baddie in Yeats's thinking. But whenever that comes in, it brings with it, man's life comes in and it turns things over, and the word terror is the word that comes in here. Now, I guess that word comes from it must have suggestions of the French Revolution
Yeah.
whenever it comes into this poem. But the terror is not simply located with the terror of the French Revolution, but it keeps on ravening through century after century. And that what you've got here is a suggestion of what was just about to happen in Western Europe, leading all the way to the rise of Hitler and to the Holocaust, or indeed in China to the Glorious Revolution, the gulags in Russia, and of course, the aftermath of an imperialism across the world and what it is that was going on with this. And then the push back against this. And yeah, you and I are talking now in just after the fall of Kabul or whatever it is. And you see all the Western powers removing themselves from one particular place and another civilization just rapidly reinserting itself, the Islamic civilization rapidly reinserting itself in the place which had been taken from it before. So you've got the hooping or the cyclical nature of these historical patterns.
There seems to be something, I guess, if I'm understanding what you're saying here, that we create these illusions of order, and we participate in the kinds of ceremonies that are designed to naturalize them, to make them seem as if they're inevitable. And yet humans have this endless capacity to continually uproot, despite how terrifying it might be, and maybe a more literal sense here, how terrifying it might be to imagine something else, to reject all of this naturalization. We inevitably do it over and over again, and that's this kind of dismantling that occurs. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And the question is that when we do it, do we then come to, given the fact that we think that all of these structures, our social structures, are illusory, legal structures, the structures of great powers, of empires, that are they an illusion? And if they're an illusion, then what is reality?
Right.
And between the third line and the seventh line of the poem, he makes that move between illusion and reality. And reality, when you find it, is desolation.
Mm-hmm. What do you, just real quickly before we move a little bit further, what do you think of ravening? I think that's one of the striking sort of oral features that alliteration we have in those hard sort of R's. I thought that's one of the effects of the poem, I guess. It makes it so powerful.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, having said ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting. As if ravening's not enough. We'll have some raging and uprooting as well too. I mean, I see in Irish terms, I see the Norman knights coming in, and I see the Cromwell and his soldiers coming in and putting whole cities to the sword. I also see, the assassinations of the War of Independence and the Civil War. And I also see bombing campaigns and suicide bombers. That there's a rage and an uprooting against the illusion by those who believe that they know what is real.
And that force of the triad there, it's the ravening, the raging, and uprooting, and it's sort of spiraling outwards as order disintegrates. And then left faced with that really powerful, the desolation of reality.
Yes. Well, the desolation of reality, and then the colon, the punctuation marks are important. No, I mean, Rob, you and I know that Yeats couldn't spell and couldn't punctuate, and that somebody might have done it for him. Some editor. I mean, somebody might know this. Peter MacDonald, who's editing the poems. I'd like to know who sat down and punctuated Yeats's poems for him. I think would be quite interesting. Was what editor did it. Interestingly enough, in the 1930s, his editor was Harold Macmillan of Macmillan Company, and Harold Macmillan went on to be a British Prime Minister, which is fascinating. The connection between Yeats's editor and the British Prime Minister is interesting. Thomas Moore in the 19th century. His biographer was a British prime minister, and he was a prime minister at the same time that he wrote Moore's biography. I know that Boris Johnson is supposedly writing a biography of Shakespeare while he's also prime minister, but then I understand that the publisher has been waiting for that book for many years, so it may not come through. But there's this idea that of the connection here between the the official powers and the desolation of reality, and what it is when you look at that. So it's what happens after the colon: Egypt and Greece goodbye, and goodbye Rome, and then that amazing line with, and when you put the exclamation mark in there, it just becomes kind of gleeful, doesn't it? Or tonally, I mean, how would you describe it? What's the tone of the line with the exclamation mark in it?
Yeah, there is this kind of strange delight. And I know, as you said before, the word hysterical is so loaded, but there is that sense of being, if we can, think about it more broadly, this being captivated by this recognition of the desolation and the sort of exuberance and excitement about seeing the collapse. It has this feeling of, for me, of a kind of the glee that one sees sometimes in the eyes of people in a kind of mob, or when they're and a mob's also a loaded term, of course.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
can barely
Yeah.
speak anymore.
Yeah.
But that moment when you're captivated, so captivated by this destructive move and the delight in destroying all that you'd been taught was natural and orderly, and seeing it fall apart. And it's terrifying and liberating simultaneously. And I think Yeats is so good at capturing those. I mean, the Second Coming has a lot of that same kind of feeling to it for me,
Yeah.
capturing the kind of ecstasy in destruction.
It,
Um,
yes, and what it is to be a member of that mob or whatever it is, or what it is to be to where you've got a mass movements, and the ways in which mass movements kind of take over, they are so wedded to an illusion in the interests of thinking that they're trying to show you the real,
yeah.
that they get completely taken over by what they're doing. Now, I apologize for being an Irish person based in the UK, looking back at the storming of the Capitol, right?
It's okay.
But of course, this was I know this was a traumatic moment in recent American history. It now and will be thought of as such for many years. But I remember one person being interviewed after a woman being interviewed after she had been expelled from the Capitol, and she was in tears, and she was there. She'd been tear gassed, and she was thought, "This is terrible. Why are they doing this to me? Why are they doing to me? It's supposed to be a revolution."
Mhm.
Uh,
I saw that too. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
remember that particular
Yeah.
interview. So that there was something that was going on there about a movement. Everybody had been wound up to such a pitch of conviction that they were doing the right thing. And then, of course, what they were doing was this massive upsurge of violence. Now, I'm not saying this was entirely just something which randomly occurred on the day. It looks as if there was planning involved in it, and that there were people in there who were ideologues who were involved in what they're doing. And the responsibility of the politicians themselves, I don't know about that. But there was something that we saw as we saw it being televised. I know that Gil Scott Hearn said the revolution will not be televised, but most revolutions are being televised, and
Mhm.
it's extraordinary when we see them. In the same way that if you read Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, you get the recreation of the French Revolution, or Thomas Carlyle's version of the French Revolution. One of my favorite ones is a trades union riot in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, which is, and actually oddly enough, the trade union riot is because the bosses are bringing in Irish workers to
Mm.
break the strike. So the strikers all have a riot. So there's an idea of what the mob is like, and that's a live thing in the middle of a theme of Victorian England, of a liberalizing society, who thinks that if you just go the liberal way, you will get rid of all of these forces which result in terror.
Mm. Mm. I'm teaching some late 19th century Irish literature right now in my classes, and talking about the big houses and the sort of ceremonies that bind together these homes, and the response to the land wars and the land league. And you can see, uh, you can imagine a society looking on as if the world that they exist within is inevitably the necessary world, that it is, that it has a kind of solidity, and then the inability to, this sort of slack-jawed, and trying to respond to reform, trying to respond with reforms and these liberalizing measures, and never being able to reinforce among the greater populace this kind of naturalization drive, and being confronted with this ravening and this raging and uprooting. And so I think one of the things that when I'm talking with my students, and inevitably they talk a bit about the Capitol riots as well, these moments are not, we imagine, I think, that what's going on historically for us is somehow unique, but the poem, and one of the strengths of this poem is it sort of suggests this is something that is running, that is fundamental, that is always there, that this impulse
Yeah.
to tear down the illusion and replace with something else is
Yes.
there, because man's life is thought.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then to grandly dismiss the whole thing, as you were saying at the outset, thousands of years,
Yes.
the whole
Yes.
thing, Egypt
Yes.
and Greece goodbye, and goodbye Rome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, to sum it all up in that way at the end of the octave is really brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, it's and the as was the case in the 1930s, and as the case is the case now, the Dane. I'll be careful about this because no, it's not necessarily a danger, because the people's voice is an important thing, and we live in liberal democracies, and you do listen to the people.
Mhm,
That's why you have elections. But then, whenever that version of the people's voice is set against a kind of a populism,
mhm,
and the populism which enabled the Germans, for the Nazi Party, to overturn, to manipulate the German election. From my point of view, the manipulations of the American election, and the question about whether it was valid election or not, or whether the election itself was a manifold illusion.
mhm,
So there
mhm,
is a question about truth and lies here, and all you need is somebody to say that something is a lie, and it's a lie, and then you just debate over whether it was or not. And Yeats knows that if that is where we are taking each other on, then that these are the conditions of mere anarchy, aren't they?
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
And so all of these moments, if they occur, they're inevitable in human history, that we will constantly have these disruptions. But it's not as if we can't make ethical judgments about what's going on, and
Yes.
that's important. And I think you're right, absolutely right
Yeah.
about
Yeah. I know. I agree with you, Rob, and I think it's really interesting to think about the ethics of this poem
that. Mm,
as it brings this material into the open. I think that Yeats's ethical sophistication and ethical sensitivity is underrated, and particularly as it would appear he was um, courting the kind of these kinds of tonal moments where he was aware that he could just burst that barrel and de-hoop civilization, and
mhm,
could see that that's what was happening to it. But I
mhm,
do think that there's always an ethical tug against that, both in what you could do now. And one of the ways in which you do that is to do with the construction of the poem as such. In other words, this is a rather beautifully, rather conventionally structured, ordered sonnet,
mhm,
and that itself is a form of civilization which, when Yeats's time, was 600 or 700 years old, and he knew that that would be the case, not just as an English form, but also primarily as an Italian form. So there's an Italian idea of order and a civilization which is coming through here. I know the couplet at the end is the English sonnet, as opposed to the intertwining, the barrel, the knitting together of the Petrarchan. But there's something going on here about he knows that what he's doing with the shape and the form of the thing, and that is something that is a kind of an ethical pressure in itself. But the question is whether you think that's enough.
Mm.
And also the question is whether you think it's enough simply to head up to a holy mountain, which is what Meru is, and then do what he does at the end of Lapis Lazuli. And that this is a replaying of what he does in Lapis. I think this comes after Lapis Lazuli, doesn't it? Is that right? Or is Lapis Lazuli
Lazuli is in new poems, right? Yeah. So no, Lapis Lazuli is after this.
After this, yeah. And Lapis Lazuli starts with the Stuka dive bombers, doesn't it? In the of Guernica and of the Spanish Civil War, isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's aware of what happens when you get a manifestation of this terror, or the terror from the skies of the air campaign.
I was thinking about that too. I mean, you can't help but thinking about Lapis Lazuli when you read this poem, and that idea of old civilizations put to the sword, and that's again this kind of ethical complexity here. There's a sort of there's in the line the tonal side of it is reflecting on this vast expanse of history, and we think civilizations put to the sword, and then there's a part of us, of course, who think, well, but we're talking about human beings. we're talking about actual people here, and those kinds of complexities are what I think makes Yeats really sophisticated, actually, in his poetry. I also like what you're saying, also, to go back to the point you made a moment ago about the aesthetic itself as providing something, as a kind of ethics in the form itself.
Yeah.
And that art can provide us with a way of thinking about this process in human history, and to apprehend it and to contemplate it. And the question, as you're saying, is that enough? Is it enough to step back into that kind of contemplative mode, which is in the sestet, the tone sort of changes, right? And we have that Lapis Lazuli style moment of sort of stepping back on the mountain.
Yes, we do, and the I mean, for what Yeats does brilliantly is every time he has one idea, he then has another idea.
Yeah.
And it's not exactly the opposite idea, although it's calm in a certain way. Although I was going to say it's calm. I think that the violence and the ravening and raging of the octave does continue into the sestet. But it seems to have been muted down, so there's a tonal shift in what he's doing here. But there are still things which are left behind from the civilization. In other words, to the last line, his glory and his monuments are gone. So the monumental is destroyed by the end of it. The monuments are gone, and I know Yeats was interested. Is it Nineveh? There's the mythical city in the middle of the desert in Mesopotamia or Iraq, or what would now be Iraq, the place that was left, of which there is no record of a civilization that people knew that were there. So he's really interested, but what would be if you could just wipe the whole thing out again? But I just say two things about how the previous bit is not left behind. The first thing is that Mount Meru is not a place.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? It is a holy mountain, and it may be like in Kashmir, or it might be in Afghanistan. But it is not a place, but it is an Indian word, Meru.
Mm-hmm.
But Everest is not an Indian word.
Mm-hmm.
Everest is an English word named after a man, I think. Is that right? Yes. Everest is an English word. So you've got Mount Meru, which is a mythical place, and you've got Everest, which is a real place, right? The place which they were trying to conquer all the way through climb all the way through the 1930s. And that what you've got left behind there is something, it always reminds me of Rudyard Kipling, and it reminds me of these extraordinary fictions of empire, and what is left behind, the questions of these empire, these places which are the places to which certain civilizations, not just the Western civilization, because the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans all had a go at this as well. And indeed, within India itself, of course, it had its own aristocracy, its own hierarchies, its caste system. These are not ideal, places that are ravened or raged or uprooted. It's part of his version of history, but that there's a trace in those two words, Meru and Everest, of the imperial struggle which went on and still goes on when we look east, and that there's something that happens with our eastward looking, and it's still in our eastward looking. And I think Yeats ethically knows that. And I know this is a massive conversation in contemporary literary criticism, and it's to do with what is, when we're reading literature, what are we reading? Are we reading the white man's literature? Is there something else that's going on in here? But Yeats certainly, all through his career, way back to the time when she was friendly and a supporter of Tagore at the beginning of the 1907 or so, when he first met Tagore himself, and Ezra Pound indeed first met Tagore, he knew that there was a world historical or a world literary issue here as well, even when it looked as if you're looking for some kind of Buddhist or Zen peace to set against the Western the Western civilizations which rip themselves apart.
Matt, that's great. I think that's really important because Everest, the word Everest there is the one that I tend to pass over as I'm reading the poem. I think of Meru, I think of the East, I think of this kind of mystic, this placeless, imagined, state of contemplation, and sort of Everest. You just think, oh well, it's an actual mountain, big mountain, of course, but it's not a sort of throwaway word there. Right, and it does have that trace, and I think that's absolutely right, and forms a nice connection then between the second part of the poem back to the first part.
Yeah, I mean, why is the poem could be called Everest?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we would look at that completely differently in that case, because it doesn't look as if we're looking at a piece of Easternism, Orientalism, I should say. It doesn't look as if we're coming upon Orientalism. It looks as if we're coming upon a bit of imperialism. There's no reason why it couldn't be called Everest. In fact, Everest gets the rhyme, dreadful blast. Doesn't it? Whereas Meru doesn't, although it's there in hermit and cavern, I suppose, in the sound, in the assonance, even in drifted where Meru or where that snow and winter's dreadful blast. I mean, it's this beautiful movement of the English words against the Indian. I don't know. Is it a Buddhist word? Is it a Hindu word? I don't know don't know. But there's certainly something going on. That's why I think about. I love the bit in Kipling's Kim, where Kipling and the holy man are heading up into Kashmir, or rather Kim and the holy man are heading up into Kashmir, and you can see the eternal mountains ahead of you, and they're just heading off. And at the same time, this is kind of imperial spy story going on. Amazing stuff, and I can see that happening together. Yeah, Kipling and Kim and Yeats, by the way, were the same age. They were both born in 1865, and there's quite interesting ways in which you might put these two figures together if they knew each other. There has been a book on the subject.
One of the things. Which book is that? Was that the meeting without knowing it?
That's it. Yeah.
What's interesting too in this second half of the poem, then we go from this sort of grander vision of humanity to something more embodied and focused on these hermits, sort of making their way through the snow and their naked bodies, and this kind of the force of this suffering. And is that enacting the sort of that experience of confronting the desolation of reality?
Yeah, I think that there's a really one massive. Okay, the two things. One is the desolation of reality. Do you come back to a condition of pure being in the Heideggerian sense, as opposed to the doing, which is the obsession of active people, politicians, soldiers, revolutionaries, right? So you've got being and doing. You've got this question going on here, but there's another word in here. So the naked bodies might be the desolation of reality. What is it to be naked and to just purely to be, right? But of
Mm.
course, it's also there's snow and winter, and those are the versions of desolation that are here. But
Mm.
there's a really big word in here to allow. Sorry, getting terribly philosophical here, and I hope there aren't any philosophy students listening in because we're bound to get this wrong. But the word is know, K-N-O-W.
Mm.
What do they know? What do we know? Who knows? What is the subject which goes against that verb know? Is it hermits know? Is
Or
it man as in man's life at the start? Because hermits upon Mount Meru, say the sentence goes, hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest dot 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 know that day brings round the night.
mm.
Or does something else know that? Because the grammar's funny, because it's know that day brings round the night, that before dawn his glory and his monuments are gone. Who is he?
Mm. Mm.
Is that man, as in man's life in the third line? It can't be hermits because they're plural.
Mm.
Is it day has glory and monuments? If you
Well,
look at the syntax, it's really quite complicated because it's hard to know what the subject of the sentence know is. Because if you had full knowledge, then you would know what what was a manifold illusion and what wasn't. And then you would know what is the desolation of reality and what isn't.
mhm.
That's knowledge, right?
Mhm.
But the knowledge is that day brings round the night, that before dawn his glory and his monuments are gone.
Mm.
And all we know is that all will go.
Mm.
That's not his rhyme, but yeah.
It's fascinating because there seems to be, and this often happens with Yeats, especially when the poems that are more mystical, this sense that there is some kind of knowledge that exists, but to which we do not have and cannot in this life have access. And so there's a kind of hint here of something, some other subject of this sentence beyond. It doesn't, and I think you're right. I hadn't really thought about it in these terms. I mean, it's the hermits. Do they know this? I mean, they're naked in the snow. Do they have this knowledge? Does man in the abstract have this
Yeah,
knowledge, or is there
yeah.
some kind of other
Yeah.
level that?
Who knows? Who
Yeah.
knows? And who or what knows?
Yeah.
And is the state of mysticism of a hermit on Meru, is that mystical state a state of knowledge, and or which is also a state of pure being,
Yeah.
the
That has.
desolation of reality, of the real, right? Do you know what is real? Or what do you know? No, one of the most famous, one of the best uses of the verb to know is at the end of the second coming,
Yeah.
and it starts off like this, 5 lines from the end. Now I know the 20 centuries of stony sleep, right? And
Right.
when if somebody says, now I know, you think that what they're telling you is a statement. This is what I know, right? But by the time you get round to the end of that sentence, there's a question mark.
Yeah.
This is why the exclamation mark is so important here. There's a question mark. Now I know has turned into a question rather than a statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now that's brilliant Yeatsian moment, and it's a trick of the syntax because he knows what he's doing about knowing
Right.
in the grammar of the language itself. Yeah, and that something is going on here. Now this could be, again, if there was a philosopher looking in here, they might think, oh, this is just desperately confusing, and this is the kind of nonsense that poets come out with, and we should really banish them from Plato's Republic because they are dealing in fiction and unreal things.
Illusions
Right?
here. Yeah.
Yes, but at the same time, there's something we are being brought very, very close to what it is we might know about the history of the world. I mean, it's really high. The stakes are incredible here, without sounding too pretentious, right? And the closer we get to it, the less we know.
Mm. And it's that, and I've been reminded of this a lot recently because I've had a lot of conversations with my students and others about why I value poetry in a time when so much is going on in the world that demands more practical approaches, and poetry framing these fundamentally important questions and opening up these states of contemplation. And that's it's hard to explain that, but I think you showed how the syntax works here as it does in the Second Coming to evoke this kind of aesthetic response that is induces this kind of sense of contemplation and wonder and complexity of holding these multiple ideas in mind simultaneously without feeling as if we've settled or replaced one illusion with the certainty of some other illusion. So in a way
Yes.
that knowing's evoking our own sort of ongoing uncertainty, but the value of that and the importance of that contemplation.
Yes.
If
Yes.
that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly, Rob. That's what it is. I mean, one of the things that it could teach to any student, and it's a lesson that you, did you get every time you read. I still get every time I read Yeats, that there are great kind of lessons in how you approach the world from reading a great writer. Is that you've got to think in two and three and four things at once, because you know that they're thinking that, and that doesn't mean they're confused. There may be confusion there, and it may be difficult for us. You know, the idea of difficulty is important for
Mm.
Yeats. But there are foundational reading experiences in my life, reading Yeats, reading Joyce actually,
Yeah.
where it tells you that practically every word means about three things. And you know, and it's not just a rabbit hole.
Mhm.
Actually, there's something really important ethically that's going on to do with that. And then, in terms of the mystical element of it, just this is completely personally, is to get the bit at the end. Is that Wordsworth was an important reading, early reading for me as a student, because you could see what it was where somebody was working their way into certain kind of states of mind, where the thinking itself is being carried in these long, massive passages of blank reading Wordsworth's prelude as he's thinking about himself. But it's not a selfish act. It's an act of watching a mind moving over something, or as Yeats says, long-legged fly, the mind moving over silence.
Mhm. Well, I think that's a good way to end here. This was delightful. I don't teach this poem very often, in part because supernatural songs go, I always feel like I sort of have to slog through that, but we didn't really talk a ton about supernatural songs, and I'm happy about that because I'm sort of feeling like this poem can stand alone, and I could teach it sort of on its own, and it's so powerful and moving and raising such deep, important
Yeah.
questions. So that's great, Matt.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. That was most enjoyable,
Thanks
actually.
loads.
Yes.
I enjoyed that immensely, and
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing you hopefully at the conference in the International Yeats Society conference in New York. Hopefully, and if not, at the International Yeats Summer School.
Well, very much hope that we all get together and we all meet each other in a not so socially distanced way in the very near future.
Okay. Take care of yourself, Matt.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. Bye bye.